Reading all these messages, Royd realized that he was in luck. It meant he could expand his business. After all, fame meant money, and money meant a carefree old age. The man smiled because he was sure that he had a golden future ahead of him. Because of the abrupt change in his mood, he again thought that he had gone mad. Their journey to the cream was not easy. The manifestations of winter were felt more strongly as they approached their destination. They arrived in Cremo only in the middle of winter, when the city was already heavily covered with snow. Soon the men were met by a local feudal lord of Cremo, who thanked them for their visit. Royd also introduced himself and, together with Xavier, bowed to the Count. Cremo said that he had imagined Frontera a little differently, but noticed that the man exuded nobility. Suddenly, the Count approached Xavier and said that he probably had royalty in his family. Royd was embarrassed because the Count confused Xavier with him. Cremo even started asking Gabriel if he was engaged because he had a daughter. And when he tried to tell him that there was a mistake, the Count got angry because the servant Royd interrupted him. The messenger started laughing out loud at this situation. Meanwhile, it was snowing outside the window. The Count laughed when he realized that he had made a big mistake and mistaken Xavier for a nobleman. The man apologized to the swarm for this. The messenger tried to make a joke on his master, but the latter did not allow him to continue. Count Cremo was the lord of the expensive city of Cremo. He played a significant role in the novel The Knight of Steel. After all, Xavier, who was wanted after a massacre of moneylenders, came to Cremo under the active influence of the Count. However, after talking to the knight, he realized that Xavier was a decent man. After that, he played an important role as his associate. The Count said that he wanted to buy their treasures to install statues in the sea. After all, trade in their place has completely deteriorated recently. Because a few years ago, Mega Titans started appearing in the seaport. They never attacked them directly, but their mere presence was terrifying. At that moment, Royd realized that he had heard about this before. It was impossible to attack from the sea, so there was no point in a navy. Gradually, the city of Cremo fell into decline, and the Count despaired. He believed that Xavier would help him. After all, there were many hints of this in the novel, but then the end suddenly came. It was not even clear whether there would be a second season. When Royd first came into this world, he thought he knew the novel's content perfectly. But now events are happening that were not there. The Count tried to find out how to get rid of these creatures. And he came to the conclusion that the main fear of the Titans was mermaids. After all, they were the strongest warriors of the ocean. So when the Count found out that these creatures shake only at the sight of mermaids, he decided to install bronze statues of mermaids in the center of the sea. However, the man soon abandoned this idea. After all, if he made an earthen mound right in the water to support the statue, the sea would become shallow and ships would not be able to sail freely. Royd was not happy when he heard this. Against the odds, he calmed the young frontiersman down by saying that he would still honor the agreement and buy their treasure. But Royd said he could not allow him to suffer a one-sided loss. The man intended to sell his treasures for the Count at a high price and to install the statues without affecting trade routes. The friction racks and drainage wells were to help him with this. They were sure to succeed, given these two elements. When Royd and Xavier were sailing in a boat on the sea, he put a mask over his eyes and put his head down into the water with bated breath. Using his scanner, the man began to study the seabed. Fortunately, the seabed was quite flat with lots of sedimentary rocks, so the ground was soft enough. The man wanted to know if these rocks could be found even deeper in the layers of the earth. But his air ran out, and Royd immediately went up the mountain to replenish his oxygen supply. Then he noticed Gabriel's satisfied look on his face, and asked why he was smiling. And Xavier explained that he had never felt so happy watching someone else suffer. The young frontier was shocked to hear such words from his servant. When Xavier started rowing, he asked his master if he was really satisfied with the terms of the contract. But Royd asked him not to change the subject. No matter how much Xavier thought, he could not understand how to make an earthen embankment in the middle of the ocean. So the man suggested that some kind of magic was involved. Royd agreed because he planned to use cement as magic. The only problem was how cement was mixed in this world. After all, if it was Roman cement, everything should have turned out perfectly. When Xavier offered his hand to the owner to help him get up from the boat, he asked him to be less careful, so that he could easily fall into the water. Suddenly someone spoke to the men. Behind them stood a pretty girl in a fluffy dress with blonde hair, who held out an envelope with a letter for Royd. The man was momentarily confused by such beauty. The girl greeted him and introduced herself as Count Crémeau's daughter, Christine. She said that she had seen Royd yesterday in the courtyard of their estate, and was instantly ashamed. Christina closed her eyes tightly, and clutched the letter in her hands. Royd was a little embarrassed and waited to see what would happen next. The girl finally decided and handed the letter to her husband. But not to Royd, but to Xavier. Just like her father, she too had mixed up the men. In a way, the young frontline soldier expected it. Royd was a bit puzzled, although he thought it was probably the right thing to do. Xavier took the envelope from the nice woman's hands, and quickly tucked it into his pocket inside his coat. Young Christine hurried away with her servants, not believing that he had accepted her letter. Gabriel silently watched the young beauty go, and intended to leave, but the displeased master stopped him. Royd asked him if he thought everything that had happened then was normal. Xavier did not understand why the owner was so irritated, because he did not see anything wrong with accepting a love message. In a moment, Gabriel was surprised to realize that the master had probably never received a love letter before. The servant's assumptions made Royd even more angry. And then Xavier, although a little confused, decided to sincerely sympathize with the owner and support him. The messenger told the swarm that Xavier sincerely supported him. The man was very angry about this. While working on the drawings, Royd repeated over and over that he did not envy Gabriel. After all, he would soon become a rich man and earn a lot of money. When Count Crémeau approached him, he did not recognize him at first, and responded rudely. But a moment later he apologized, explaining that he was concentrating on his work. The Count came to report that almost all the materials he had requested had been delivered, all but the volcanic ash. Roth thought about it, because it was a key material for Roman cement. The advantages of such cement were obvious. After all, any structure made of such cement could stand for more than 2,000 years. Its reliability was unconditional. The Count said that it was possible to get the ash if you went to where the volcanoes were. The only problem was that the journey to such a place could take 6 months, which was too long even for him. However, Royd encouraged the man by saying that he had a solution. His plan was to forget about Roman cement and replace it with Portland cement. This type of cement was already a modern material. Royd only knew roughly how to mix it, but his lack of knowledge was in the details. Even if he didn't know what to do, he could always at least try. The man decided to try everything he could. Days passed, and the winter weather was frosty in the city. There was a pile of crushed cement on the man's desk. The sample number 129 failed, although the swarm seemed to have succeeded. He should have chosen the right mixing ratio. And if it wasn't that, then the problem was in the drying. The man decided to add 4 more indicators. Subsequently, he calculated other indicators to achieve the perfect result. Meanwhile, his little helpers watched their master suffering with pity and sympathy. Then they pounced on him to go for a walk with them. But the man refused because he was busy. The man became irritated and shook his head to drive the little creatures away. Then he shouted at his friends that he was busy. And at that moment, he remembered the cute little puppy that was his friend. Royd began to remember his little friend who died when he was still living in his world. The man noticed his little paw peeking out from under the burial cloth. At that time, Kim Soo Ho was not himself, sitting near the body of his four-legged friend. The man bitterly mourned the loss because this puppy was all he had left. Kim apologized to the little puppy. He wanted to pet it again and play with it together. And at that very moment, Roy grabbed his little helpers and hugged them all together. The young front told them that they were much more valuable to him than this research. It was already night outside, and the moon was illuminating the sea waves. Roy was walking along the coast with his little friends. Suddenly a man said he was a terrible person. The bell pallet and the hippo did not understand what their master was getting at. After all, everything was going according to plan because he was just giving orders as if they were some kind of robots. He added that there was no bigger TV dork in the world than him, so he was very sorry about it. A moment later, the young frontline soldier stopped abruptly to kneel down in front of his friends. The man sincerely thanked his assistants, because it was all thanks to them. The little creature smiled sincerely at the man in return. The messenger said that the magical creatures felt his sincerity towards them. He also explained that his little helpers see him as their family. The level of sympathy of magical beings increased to family ties. Roy was surprised at this development. After all, these little creatures considered him a family member. The messenger informed him that the bell enhancement function was now available to him. Thus, with its help, the swarm could master a new skill for 500 RP. This was exactly the special skill he had not even thought about. Then the Padong and the Hypo brought the bell forward, so that the swarm could discover a new skill. So whatever the new skill of the bell was, the man agreed because he knew he would find a use for it. Meanwhile, the messenger activated the upgrade function and asked him to choose a magical creature. Even if the skill was useless, the swarm agreed to it because the bell wanted it. In a moment, it was standing in the center of a blue magic portal. It lifted the creature up and illuminated it with a bright light. There was a bright pop that threw the swarm and other creatures a meter away from the bell. At the same time, the messenger reported that the first level upgrade was successful. As a reward for the upgrade, new skills were unlocked, namely, soil absorption, land cultivation, and metal production of the third level. Also, the bell received a new special skill of volcanic eruption of the first level. Roy was very excited about this upgrade. The next morning, the weather was freezing in the trading city of Cremo. Suddenly, a powerful explosion was heard over a mountain near the town. The townspeople were very worried to hear such a loud sound. Count Cremo was also seriously frightened and looked out the window. He saw thick black smoke rising behind the mountain. It was the work of a bellflower that, after being upgraded, had staged a volcanic eruption. Behind it, Royd and Xavier were watching the process. The man could not believe that they managed to get volcanic ash with the help of a bell. His plan really worked. Royd was happy and asked Xavier how he felt about it. But the servant did not hear his master. Because the man had forgotten to tell him to cover his ears, Xavier could not hear him. Royd took the opportunity to say that Gabriel was ugly. He even replied that he was not as ugly as his young master. Thanks to the bell, the problem with the cement was quickly resolved. In the world of construction, speed is life, so they had to start right away. First, they had to provide the bell with a giant diaper to filter the ash. On the other side of the diaper, they had to attach a 5-layer sieve. All the townspeople gathered in the square to watch this interesting spectacle. When everything was ready, the man covered his ears and told the bell to start. The bell's volcanic eruption skill was activated. When the diaper inflated, the man ordered the bell to make a second attempt. The game in Crimea was also watching this action. The man covered his ears and did not understand how it was happening, because it was beyond his understanding. He wanted to know everything so that he could tell the king in detail. After all, if his talent was really as great as everyone said, it would be very sad to show it somewhere on the outskirts of life. Once all the materials for the cement were collected, it was time for step 2. This step consisted of building a discharge well where the cement was to be poured. Later they installed the well in the sea with the help of a giant crane, and the water was pumped out of the well thanks to the skill of the hippos. The third step was to drive the fractional posts into the ocean floor inside the well. When Xavier was done, he asked when the next batch of racks would be delivered. Royd replied that he would have to wait because it took some time to deliver them. The man looked at the servant silently and smiled. Xavier asked what the emotion was on his face. Royd replied that he was waiting for Gabriel to start telling him that he was a knight and shouldn't do this. For a few seconds, the men just looked at each other in silence. And then Xavier turned around and left, leaving the hammer on the ground. Royd began to tell him that if Xavier did not work with the hammer, he would not earn any money and, as a result, would not pay the debt. And when he was exhausted from despair, the Baron would be desperate, and the Baroness would follow. Therefore, the young frontier began to beg the brave knight to protect his family. Xavier was annoyed, but he still grabbed the hammer and continued to drive the posts into the ocean floor. After he finished practicing, they made strong rod frames with steel protrusions at the ends. Finally, they poured the long-awaited cement from the ship into the mold. After the cement had set, they dismantled the well and freed the cement structure. Now the artificial sea soil was laid in the base of the future statue. Royd reported to the Count that the column was 50 centimeters higher than the water level in the ocean. If they put the statue there, it would rise above the water. Crémeau agreed with this. In fact, he still did not believe that such a column could support the weight of a statue. However, if everything worked out, he promised to be generous with the man. Royd was happy with the Count's decision. Night came, and the sea was slightly stormy. In the middle of the sea, the statue was already mounted on a cement column. Around it were ships covered with garlands and bright lights. The body of the statue was decorated with various golden jewels. Meanwhile, a lavish feast was in full swing on the ship. There were many people on deck. Royd was worried about the tie around his neck that was too tight. He asked Xavier how he could wear it at all. This surprised the servant because Royd spoke of it as if it was the first time he had dressed like that. Xavier remembered that his master had already participated in similar outings. The young frontier was embarrassed, explaining that it was a long time ago. At the same moment, the conversation was interrupted by Count Crémeau, who addressed all those present and asked for a moment of their attention. When the guests turned their attention to him, he said that Royd had made an invaluable contribution to the installation of the statue. Suddenly, a crowd of people rushed over to Xavier, wanting to get to know him better, shake his hand, and express their admiration for his work. Royd was smart enough to realize where this was going. But he kept telling himself that he was not jealous at all, and that money was more important to him than praise and recognition. However, he was annoyed by the expression on Xavier's face at that moment, because the man did not want him to look at him or feel sorry for him. Count Crémeau approached the swarm and said, laughing, that it was all because of his face. At the same moment, the man put his hand on Royd's shoulder and told people that he was responsible for the installation of the statue. The people turned around and were shocked to hear this because they thought the man was just a simple servant. The feast in the middle of the sea continued. The glow from the festive garlands and lights attracted a lot of attention in the darkness of the night. The bright light also attracted the attention of the Titanic Jigu. The sea monster emerged from the water to get a better look at what was happening. Among several ships, he noticed a large merman. His eyes were filled with bewilderment and fear because the merman was their sworn enemy. The golden jewelry on the statue's body reflected the light from the ship's garlands, which scared the sea creature away even more. He stared at the statue from afar for a long time and decided to dive back into the water. A moment later, the giant decided to swim towards the merman because he was all alone and it was much easier to destroy him. Meanwhile, the swarm was kindly chatting with the guests, and Gabriel, while eating without realizing it, was fascinating young ladies and women with his appearance. While everyone was busy celebrating, Xavier was drinking quietly when he suddenly felt an ominous sensation coming from the distant sea. Royd approached the servant and asked him why he was so silent. Xavier told him that something was rapidly approaching the ship at high speed. When Royd asked him how big it was, Xavier told him that it was at least twice the size of the ship, even bigger than a full-sized hippo. Royd immediately realized what it was, and why it was headed their way. Royd immediately informed the Count of the approach of the Giga Titan. The Count informed his knight, who also had the status of a sword master, but was not as sensitive. Xavier told the Count that he felt nothing, and the Count replied that the Titan had never come this far. After all, in all these years there was no reason for him to attack now. It was then that they noticed the mermaid and realized why he had come here. The Count ordered the men to raise the anchor and move away from the mermaid statue. They all quickly started to raise the handle, but Xavier told them that they were too late. Royd ordered him to cut the anchor. Royd threw a paddle to free the ship from the statue. Xavier decides to jump into the sea himself to cut the anchor. At this point, the man uses his explosive sword and cuts the anchor. Meanwhile, the Padon also breaks the rope. After cutting the anchor, Xavier sees that the Titan is already very close. It was too fast. They dispersed the ships from the statue, but the giant Titan emerged from the water and began to destroy the ships. The giant hit the statue so hard that it flew in all directions, all the way to the city. Xavier emerged from the water and used his explosive technique to save Royd. The impact threw the statue into the air. There were too many people drowning, and the men could not save them all one by one. Royd took Hippo out and ordered him to do one favor. The hippo began to drink all the water along with the people. Xavier told Royd that the monster was heading for the city, so they had to hurry. But then, the servant saw that Royd wanted to go in the other direction from the city. Xavier asked his master where he was going, and he replied in anger that this was not their estate, and there was no way they could defeat such a monster. A moment later, he ordered Xavier to jump into the boat, and not to do anything crazy. Xavier saw the Count trying his best to save as many people as possible. Hippo, the hippo, helped him a lot. Xavier stood there extremely disappointed, and Royd kept telling him to jump into the boat because it was none of their business. Because they were only here for trade and money. Young Frontier told Xavier to let the city troops handle the situation. Then Xavier remembered the times when he had shown bravery and risked his life for the sake of people. He was someone Xavier could rely on, but no matter what he did, he was the same Royd Frontera, the same selfish person. Xavier's positive impression of him decreased by 5 points. Xavier could not let people die and told the owner that he was going back to town. Royd yelled at him and ordered him not to leave or he would die, but Xavier did not listen. He used his explosive technique and his sword as a surfboard to quickly get to the city. The Titan was already gradually destroying the city ruthlessly. The whole of Cremo was in chaos. Then the man saw the statue of the mermaid and was going to end it all. When the troops began to fire their cannons at the Titan, their shells did not leave even a scar on his body, and this only made the Titan even angrier. Then he fired a water wave at the watchtower, which was completely destroyed, and the Titan was about to crush one of the citizens. Xavier got there just in time and attacked him using his strongest blasting technique. To his surprise, he couldn't even scratch its surface carapace with his strongest attack. At the same moment, the Titan noticed him and began to actively attacking him. The monster threw the man away, and while he was in the air, he struck again with a water attack that Xavier could not dodge. As a result of this attack, Xavier received a direct blow. He was wounded and considered himself defeated. Gabriel already knew that he had no chance against such a monster, but he felt relieved that he had played the role of bait. After all, it kept the monster focused on him so that the villagers could escape and leave the place in the meantime. On the other side, Royd was still reeling from the battle, trying to convince himself that it was the right decision. Of course, he felt bad because the city was destroyed and people were dying. However, it was not his place to fight this monster, because he was only a builder, not a knight. And no matter how much he tried to convince himself, his consciousness did not allow him to leave Xavier and the people in trouble. And most importantly, Frontera thought that if the city was destroyed, he would not get the money to build it. Greed is an incredible thing. At the same moment, he brought the Bellflower to use her eruption technique to get to the city faster. Because young Frontera couldn't let some lobster-like monster take his money. Royd saw Xavier just as he was about to intervene and launch another attack. Instead, he hit a giant lobster near the building with an angry Royd. Seeing an opportunity, Xavier jumped, but his attacks kept bouncing off him. The man decided to calm down and stop. Soon, Royd returned while riding Padong and watched Xavier fight. The man realized that all their actions had no effect. So he examined the monster and realized that its shell was made of a mixture of dentin and chitin, and it was a meter thick. Seeing the structure of this shell, and the energy flowing through it, Royd realized that the monster was using its horn to dissipate energy. Further analysis showed him the monster's weak point. Then the young frontier asked Xavier to cut off this horn. Even though the servant believed that the monster would not die from this, Xavier still trusted Royd. At the same moment, Xavier was approaching the monster's horn after being advised on how to cut it off. Meanwhile, Padong was fighting off the monster's attacks. When Xavier cut off the giant's horn, right after it fell to the ground, Royd ordered Xavier to enter with his sword right between the monster's middle legs. Xavier immediately ducks under the monster to attack its weak point, but just as he was about to cut it in half, Royd saw his sword fall to the ground. In an instant, the monster almost crushed him with its weight, but luckily, a second before, Padong had managed to pull Xavier out from under the monster. Xavier thanked Padong before raising his sword. Meanwhile, the swarm moved on to Plan D. He called Padong and asked him to move to another location, while asking Xavier to lure the monster along the east coast. As the Count looked on in horror at the destruction the monster was bringing to the city, Royd appeared beside him and told him that he had a plan involving the statue the monster was so obsessed with. Xavier lured the Giga Titan to the place Royd asked for, and found a piece of the statue tied to a map. The monster was extremely angry because its attention was distracted by the statue, which gave Xavier the opportunity he needed. Xavier got to the spot and decided to use a mana blast, but it seems he became too weak from overuse. At that moment, the man fell down and began to lament his weakness, only to hear that Royd had found an opening large enough to launch his own attack. As Xavier's fall was interrupted by the hamster's kick, Royd rushed through the gap into the giant lobster shell. The man was extremely exhausted and at the end of his rope, so he then decided to ask Padong to launch him into the air, because before the battle began, Royd had used his RP reserve to level up his basic Azrahan mine technique to level 9. He was a few RP short of reaching the triple rings of the mana heart. While Royd was hanging on the monster's shell and wondering what to do, Xavier's sympathy level for him increased enough to allow him to get the extra points he needed to reach the triple rings of the mana heart. Royd invested his points in improving Azrahan's basic technique to the point where he could use a mana blast. Royd started to prepare to attack, but the moment he was about to attack, he received a hard blow to the head with a stone, which caused his focus to be broken. And instead of facing the two solid circles, all three of them unleashed the previously mentioned destructive attack. Therefore, at the cost of risking his own heart, his triple ring created a gigantic explosion that hit the monster at its weakest point. Soon Xavier woke up surrounded by his little helpers and saw the monster's corpse. Suddenly, he felt a Padong pull his finger, pointing at Royd. Xavier rushed to find his master. After examining the man, he realized that Royd's heart had stopped. Soon after, a carrier pigeon flew to the Baron with a letter from Count Cremo. After reading its contents, the Baron rushed to Cremo with the Baroness and Bayern. The letter said that the swarm, having fulfilled his duties, had fallen into a coma while defending the city from a monster. The Baron was extremely upset to the point that he was rushing to Cremo without prior preparation in freezing weather. On the way, he remembered how Royd always addressed him as "my lord," and wondered if Royd was really his son. His train of thought was interrupted when the man saw a wolf-like monster approaching them. Then their knight dismounted to meet the beast face to face. However, the beast asked him to run away, not to fight. But the man said that these creatures were super fast, and that as soon as he turned around, they would take his head off. Then the knight said that he would distract the monster and give the leaf and his wife a chance to get to the cream. After giving the two nobles a chance to escape, the Baron left, ordering Bayern to meet them in Cremo. Bayern was left alone with the beast. When its long claws flew towards the knight, he bravely fought off the monster with his sword. The furious wolf flew at the knight, but he was ready to fight back. But the wolf broke his sword in an instant. Suddenly, the beast grabbed his shoulder with its teeth and knocked Bayern to the ground with a broken sword. The knight was in a difficult position, but he had a small knife with him. He stabbed the monster in the face with it, but it had almost no effect. But at that moment, the Baron and Baroness appeared in time to attack the monster, destroyed it by plunging two swords into its body at the same time. Thus, they saved their knight. Bayern felt ashamed that he could not resist the beast alone, but the Baron told him that as a lord he was obliged to protect his subjects. However, everything suddenly changed for the worse when a whole pack of wolf beasts appeared in front of him. Bayern picked up his sword and faced the monsters as they were about to attack him. The Baron and Baroness clung to each other, thinking it was the end for them. At that moment, Xavier appeared and began to quickly chop the attackers to pieces. His sword practically did not stop, leaving only the heads of the wolves behind. Bayern was surprised to see how much Xavier had improved his skills in the short time he had been in the cream. Afterwards, Royd's parents asked Xavier if their son was okay. But the man said he was not sure of his current condition at the moment. After the fight with Giga Titan, when Gabriel found his master dead, he was scared, because if Royd didn't survive, Xavier would lose his entire house. The man took Royd's hand, and suddenly he felt a pulse, although his heart had stopped. He was breathing, albeit weakly. The servant kept his hand on the body of his pale master, and could not believe it was possible. And at that moment, the man noticed triple rings of mana in the swarm's chest. Moreover, they were spinning at an incredible speed. It was difficult for him to know the state of his heart, because he could not check it through the magnetic field. This incredible movement of the clouds was not in his heart, and the mana itself kept him alive. Then if Xavier realized that the Mega Titan met his end from a triple explosion. The man asked the owner what he was doing, knowing that he would not answer him. Soon the weather in the city of Cremo was sunny and frosty again. The townspeople were repairing their houses after the monster attack. Others were clearing away the rubble from the houses. Together with 3 nobles, Gabriel reached the city. The man said that the swarm was in the count's house, and that the doctor was currently taking care of him without any significant changes. Arcos expressed his admiration for the servant, because he was only a swarm, and he was able to resist the monster who had organized all this. Against Gabriel, he said that it was entirely the merit of the swarm master. After all, only his strength helped to end the monster. The man's parents were worried. Arcos could not believe that his son, the swarm, had such strength. However, on the way to the count's estate, he heard that other people were also trying to visit his son. Sometimes he heard talk about Royd's nobility. It was hard for the man to imagine even how many people he had saved from the water before he reached the Mahatan. One man, walking on crutches, said that if it wasn't for the swarm, he wouldn't be in front of them now. After all, the Royd saved him when he was running with a pallet, and left a bellman to clean up the debris. A group of women suggested that the fire was caused by some elements of the statue, and that if it wasn't for the swarm, the city would have turned into a sea of fire. Because everyone saw the giants appearing out of nowhere and absorbing water to put out the fire. Now it was hard to imagine the number of people in this place who now owed the swarm. It seemed that all the townspeople were standing in front of the windows of Count Cremo's mansion in anticipation. They all hoped that soon their savior would open his eyes. Suddenly, a man's voice was heard in the crowd trying to prove to everyone that Royd was the cause of all this chaos. At first, people looked at him in silence and then spoke a few words to each other. But in a moment, they all gathered together to kick the fool. The triple rings continued to spin around the heart of the mana swarm. The messenger reported that his sacrifice and bravery had made a great positive impression on the townspeople. For this achievement, he could receive a bonus if he asked for details. The young frontline soldier raised his head and opened his eyes. The man stood up in a sitting position and felt a severe headache. He remembered how he had thoughtlessly used the triple explosion. Royd asked the messenger if he was still alive. The messenger replied that it was possible, because undead people cannot dream. But Royd could not believe it because he thought that his heart was part of the settings. Instead, the messenger asked the man to pay attention to more important things. At the same moment, Xavier came into the room. His eyes showed sincere shock. Holding his head, Royd said that he had come just in time. He wanted to know when they were going to be paid for their work. At first, Gabriel was embarrassed by his master's reaction, but then he realized that he felt better. Suddenly, he heard his parents screaming. They immediately ran into the room and grabbed their son in their arms. With tears in their eyes, the parents were happy that he was okay. They were extremely worried about him. It was not important to them whether it was really their son. They were just grateful that he was alive. Soon the news of the recent events in the city of Crimea reached the kingdom of the Magenta. The letter to the king stated that the Mega Titan was destroyed and no longer posed a danger to people. The king was surprised that such an unusual young man was on his lands. He ordered his servant to send a message to the Frontera's estate inviting him and his knight. Whether it was true or not, the king met with these men in person. But it was not a king. Queen Alicia, the term Magentano, was sitting on the throne. The messenger reported that rumors of his bravery and sacrifice had spread throughout the country. Meanwhile, Royd was silently riding in a carriage, realizing everything that had happened to him. He was given a bonus of 1,500 RP for his improved reputation in the community. Royd was extremely happy about this. The assistant also told him about a new skill, the Heart of Mana. The man was able to accumulate a large concentration of mana in his heart. Mr. Royd was not surprised that he had so much energy in him even though he had been in a coma for a month. Since he had mana in his heart, he realized that in the future it would be much easier for him to work with a shovel. The messenger asked if this was all that was bothering him the most. And the swarm seemed dismissive of such an attitude toward hard-working workers from him. The messenger apologized to the owner. He explained that his mana heart was not due to training, but to the shock wave from the explosion. Therefore, his mana heart had unique features. Royd was curious to hear what they were. He had gained an exclusive option for the shock compensation skill, which allowed him to minimize the impact of any explosion. He didn't understand his new skill, and asked if he could use the triple strike anytime. Then the young frontline realized that mining would also be much faster thanks to this. The messenger asked him to say something cooler. And Royd thought that now he was humiliating mining as well. But he again apologized to the owner for this. Although the reason why the heart of the mana had to be protected from the consequences of the explosion was that mana was like a storehouse of ammunition. One had only to strike a match and everything would instantly fly into the air. Since the consequences of the impact are catastrophic, if the heart is not protected, you can lose your life. But at that moment, Royd did not have a mana heart. That's why he is still alive, because the shock waves settled in his heart. Trying to save his life, it turned into a mana heart. While the swarm's mana heart was developing powerfully, he didn't even notice it, thinking that waving a shovel was much more useful. The man realized that sometimes it would not hurt him to act like a fool. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the Count of Cream, who entered the carriage and apologized for the wait. The Count got into the carriage. Royd looked slyly to the side and licked his lips. In a moment, their carriage moved forward. The young front man stared silently out the window, leaning on his elbow. He looked at the destroyed houses and the road and asked the Count how much it would cost to rebuild them. Cremo replied positively that the repairs could cost more than their monthly budget for the town. At that moment, Royd thought that if the Mega Titan had not died, their expenses could now exceed the city's annual budget. The Count started to get angry and asked what the man meant. The man replied that compared to the annual budget, the payment he received was hardly even pocket money. He laughed and added that who would have thought that a statue erected to fight a Mega Titan would bring such trouble. After all, no one can be blamed for their choice because this choice was made by nature itself. However, thanks to the fact that there were people who were willing to sacrifice themselves, it is good that everything worked out. And also when Royd thought about it, he remembered that he had overheard the servants. They said that those who work in the interests of the townspeople, regardless of their status, should definitely be compensated. Royd added that he was only curious to know how strong the interest of his townspeople was. The sweaty and irritated Count said that he would pay him 1.5 times more. Royd silently looked out the window, thinking about the Count's offer. The furious Cremo asked if this would be enough for him. However, the young broker apologized for the misunderstanding between them, because he had not asked for more money. But now he knew that for him, the lives of the townspeople were worthy of an increase in remuneration of only 1.5 times the total amount. The Count was stunned by Frontera's conclusion. Meanwhile, their chariot was traveling fast on the stone road. While Royd was silent, the Count decided to offer double payment. However, the man did not react to this. Cremo began to sweat profusely and offered triple the amount. Royd was extremely pleased to hear this, but tried not to show his satisfaction to the Count. Cremo finally calmed down and could exhale. Suddenly, Royd stretched out his hands to the Count. The man said that he was impressed by the Count's clever distribution of funds. He said he would consider it compensation that he could spend in the right way. The man shook hands with the swarm in embarrassment, realizing that it was all a demand for clean water. However, he did not hate him. For some reason, he was not even annoyed. Suddenly the townspeople saw the Count's carriage approaching them. The carriage stopped and all the people were happy to see Royd. The man looked out the window and smiled, because in Korea he was just a piece of garbage. The excessive attention of people began to tire him. The Count said that there were magic balls on the podium that amplified the sound. All this was for the sake of the townspeople to listen to the swarm. Royd was sitting in the carriage wondering what he would say on stage, because he was definitely not making money with his passion. When the man took the stage, he saw hundreds of townspeople chanting his name with excitement. At first, he was hesitant to speak, but then he gathered his courage and put his hand on the magic ball. He was amazed by the number of people present. At the same moment, the man said that if he could get money from each of them, it would be very wonderful. He asked if everyone already knew about his heating system. However, the people's faces showed surprise at the new words they heard. He looked around and realized that no one in the town had heard of it. The man said that the older generation suffered from joint pain in the winter, and parents were worried that their children would get sick. He asked how much time they spent on making fire. Maybe an hour or two a day. So if they are over 50 years old, they have already spent 15 years of their lives doing this. He said that if they consider it a lot of time, they should memorize what a heating system is. After all, thanks to this, the quality of life of all the townspeople could increase tenfold. For more information, the man asked them to contact him and visit the frontier estate. With that, he ended his speech. The man silently turned around and left. The Count knew the reason why he simply could not hate him. After all, Royd had a thorough approach to all financial matters. He was persistent but reasonable. Besides, he did everything he had to do. So instead of hating him, he wanted to make him his subordinate. After all, it would have been too stupid for him to keep him in the wilderness where he came from. Frontera's estate was to become his sweet gold mine. And the main knight here was Mr. Baron. He was honest, sincere, hard-working, everything was fine, but compared to his perseverance, his knightly skills were mediocre. The Count was a problem, because he thought his knightly skills were even less than average. Royd sat silently in the hall opposite Baron. The latter told him that all the preparations were complete. He handed the man a list of land allocations. The knight explained that they had decided to deal with the problem of labor shortages on the farms, while the orcs were to take over the work in the mines. And thanks to a neighboring estate, they were able to secure a large contract for the installation of a heating system. With a 30% discount, the net profit rate was 10%. Taking into account the volume of coal sales, the final net profit rate was over 50%. Knight wanted to continue with the waterproofing and rehabilitation, but Royd stopped him. He asked if Baron had been doing all this himself while he was away. The knight looked at the owner in confusion. He said he was just fulfilling his request to keep an eye on things while he was away. Suddenly, a worker came into the room and said that the last level of the heating system had been laid and asked the knight to take a look. Seeing the knight's capabilities, Royd realizes that if he had been born in Korea, he would probably have become a managing director of a large corporation. It seems that the contracts for the supply of floor insulation lent themselves well to Baron's leadership. Royd's parents concluded that their son was close to paying off the debt. While Royd and Gabriel were overseeing the construction of the coal warehouse, a trumpet sounded to announce the arrival of someone. Royd felt an ominous feeling from the pompous messenger, who announced the arrival of the king's envoy. The messenger began to read out the contents of the letter, which stated that Royd and Xavier were summoned to the royal capital for an audience with Queen Alicia. Royd was not very happy, remembering how he had been dragged into the work because he was good at something. Now he felt that his pride had been hurt, and he would have to work even harder. The man was already saying goodbye to his lovely country and his noble life. Meanwhile, Royd and Xavier were being taken in the royal carriage, and the young frontier looked like a corpse, and Xavier tried to cheer him up in his own way, saying that a gentleman he knew would like to extort as much money as possible from the queen. These traits were inherent in Royd, as a money-hungry person leading to the Empress. After the first greetings, the Empress asks Javier about the man. She thinks he might be a worthy sparring partner, but Javier apologizes, saying he is just a nameless knight. The Empress in return expressed her gratitude for their feats, as well as the two that had taken place in the cream. And later she said that she did not care much for other people's recommendations, and would prefer to see for herself their skills. She intended to test the skills of the swarm. Alicia asked the man which construction project he thought was the most advantageous in the color purple. Since Royd knew everything from the book, he knew the correct answer was to repair the crumbling palace, but he decides to say he would build a new bridge on the Purple River that runs through the capital, knowing that. The Empress asks him the reason for this decision. Royd replies that others might think that repairing the royal palace is the most urgent thing to do right now, given that the dragon has flown off the palace tower twice in the past. He also said that the way the palace is built now is the reason why the structure is crumbling, but that repairs are only necessary afterwards, so it cannot be considered urgent. After they read each other's thoughts, Royd said that the current bridge over the Purple River has already been rebuilt 12 times because it regularly collapses when the water rises, and that if she gave him a construction contract, he could build a bridge that would never collapse. His idea was to build a modern suspension bridge. Despite the man's insolence, the Empress realizes that the more she talks to him, the more she likes him. Meanwhile, the woman begins to ask the swarm about the details, and he begins to talk about suspension bridges. In the novel, the Empress was betrayed by the one she cherished, who lost his arm and turned into an evil tyrant butcher. Royd offered the Empress his head if the bridge failed, and she smiled and agreed, until Royd mentioned a written contract that irritated the Empress. When he questioned her words, the royal said that it was just a contract, and he would be hanged if he did not fulfill it. After sweet talks with the Empress, the swordfisher is happy to have gotten the contract and not lost his head. Meanwhile, the Empress's bodyguard Sir Kyle is talking to the Empress. The man speaks of the swarm's insight. He asked her if she was unhappy, and she said yes, because he seemed to know from the beginning that he would defeat her. But his pathetic posture was adorable afterward. Royd leaves the pole, leaving Xavier behind because he continues to attract the attention of women from everywhere in the capital. Royd goes to see Baron Frontera, his younger brother, who is studying at the Royal Academy, and his parents have committed suicide. Eventually, Royd reaches the academy and finds Julian, who is supposed to be Xavier's age, and sees that he is very skilled in defense. Royd decides to act as if he has turned a new leaf, becoming kinder than the Royd he was supposed to be. Julian is already suspicious of him because he hasn't called him names, and has even done what his mother told him to do. Royd turned around to leave before Julian became even more suspicious, but remembered that his mother had asked him to have lunch with him, so he reluctantly asked Julian if he knew of a restaurant where they could have lunch. While Lloyd tries to be as much of a jerk as he should be, everything falls short of Julian's expectations. They have lunch, and Julian continues to puzzle over how Lloyd has changed so much. Royd has changed so much that he gets hit in the head by another student who starts bullying him. Julian, because he forgot something, and then begins to despise the Frontera family, openly calling Julian names. The impoverished Royd realizes that the academy values status more, and students are annoyed when the son of a poor village baron is the best in the class. Royd wonders if he should intervene, but Julian looks at him to keep him out of it. Suddenly, the student starts talking about being the heir to the Lacona Dyed Fabrics Company. Hearing this, the evil side of the swarm wakes up, and he asks the student who his father is, and learns that it is the Viscount. Before he can say more, Lloyd beats the student across the room. Meanwhile, other bullies try to intervene and get randomly slapped one after another. After beating up all the others, the Viscount's son, Diego Lacona, punches the swarm in the face, which brings an evil smile to the man's face. He begins to kick Diego thoroughly, grinning ear to ear like a maniac. Julian intervenes, grabbing the swarm from behind to stop him. The man tells Julian that he doesn't have to worry about being bullied after this because Diego will not be able to bully him. After all, if he is dead, the swarm will start beating Diego again. When the dean and his guard show up, the swarm introduces himself to the dean and then apologizes to him for causing such a commotion, saying that he was only. He says that Diego is responsible for the abuse, even though he knows that the staff probably already knew about the abuse Julian was suffering, but could not do anything about it. Fearing to upset the aristocrats, the dean asks what this has to do with Her Majesty. Before the royalty takes out the coat of arms marking him as a royal guest, the dean kneels before the coat of arms, but intends to treat the offenders better as if they were the coat of arms, because the coat of arms was only a temporary hope to calm him down. Royd knows the dean's intentions quite well, so he went with Julian to the office to ask for a leave of absence. Julian yelled at him for ruining his life, thinking the bullying would get worse, and for making him miss school. But Royd reassured him that studying here would be useless. Soon after, at the royal palace, Julian met Xavier, who suggested that he trust the swarm's plan, which Julian could not believe. Xavier told him that it was the swarm that planned to destroy the Giga Titan, along with all the developments he had made in the royal palace. The swarm had been listening to their conversation through the door. Julian asked Xavier if someone could really change like him. Xavier replied that he thought it was impossible, and that the swarm was probably someone in disguise. Then suspicions arose in his mind, and he told Julian that he had read that his soul could theoretically inhabit someone else's body using a powerful mana binding, and so he had been investigating the swarm secretly to find out if there was any mana flow that was inhabiting someone else's soul in his body. He found no such anomaly, much to Royd's relief. But he didn't even realize that Xavier knew what he wanted, and knew that Julian didn't know that his family was in debt. However, he still paid tribute to Royd for handling it. Then the man received RP, and now that Julian's favorability rating has increased, Royd entered the room and tells Julian that they are going to practice. Royd made a pizza out of stone and clay and let the bellhop eat it to create metal wires, which Pong later rolled into cables. The man then gave Julian a shovel, saying it was an important task. Julian asked why he had given him such an important task, to which Royd replied that it was because he thought he was smart and responsible. Royd went to his workshop to borrow some technology that could help him create the suspension bridge and met with the royal dwarf master Corgoodies. Royd knows that Corgoodies is a stubborn old dwarf and won't budge until he is interested, so he gets the blueprints and forces Corgoodies to look at them. Corgoodies tells him he doesn't want to see him, but not before he sees his interest peak. As the swarm starts to leave, a dwarf stops them, saying that the structure could break if it is not properly installed. Royd objects, saying that he is well aware of the consequences if anyone other than Corgoodies helped with the construction. When the dwarf was done, he looked at the blueprints and agreed to help with the installation. So the process began. Royd went with Xavier to work on the suspension towers. When they were just starting, nobles with guards appeared and began to accuse Royd of fraud. Royd was taken to the Empress, where the nobles complained that there was already a bridge on the river that had stood for 30 years, and Lloyd was trying to build another one. The Empress calls everyone to the table, and both sides begin to present their arguments. The first to speak is the Builders Guild, with Victor, the leader of the Builders Guild, who claims that the purple bridge has been standing for 30 years, and says that it will fall like a slide. A slide on the guild. Royd cannot recall future events, so instead he asks the official sitting next to the leader how much he is paid to do this. The accusation is clear, and the Empress is encouraged to emphasize the writer's mistake as an unfounded accusation against a royal official. At the same moment, the woman orders that the Royd be tied up and an executioner placed over him. The Empress declares that he has insulted her with his lies, and now she must restore her honor. Kavya was already reaching for his blade when the Empress asked the swarm if he had any last words. He said to destroy the entire family of the culprit. The Empress asks Victor and the official if they agree, and they agree, and the Empress declares that she will prove her vassal's innocence. She summoned magicians to cast a confession spell on him. As a result, the vassal is found to be corrupt, and they are both immediately punished and paraded in public half-naked. Royd appears and tells us that he begged the Empress not to harm their families, and the Empress in turn also ordered all the workers in the kingdom to help with the construction of the bridge. The work went smoothly, and the suspension tower was quickly completed with cables attached to both suspension towers. Julian and Xavier looked at the completed bridge, and Royd received 1,050 RP along with the Empress's granting of the title of Master Builder. The problem of the estate's debts would now be solved. But the question remained that the Empress would now want to use Royd's abilities further. She asked him to return with her to the royal palace, but the man intended to break free from the Queen's power and solve the problem with Julian's academy. At the palace, the Empress presented Royd with a title of nobility. Royd earnestly asked the Empress for something more, saying that he would like her to withdraw the offer of the land and title, and in return, he would like a thorough purge of the Royal Academy. Lloyd explained that it was currently full of corruption and inequality, where lower-ranking students were subjected to physical and mental suffering. He believed that The academy was now just a platform for students to exercise their power rather than to learn. The man then asked Xavier to produce a document detailing the results of their 4-month investigation into the academy's graduates and teachers who had left the academy because of corruption, including their testimonies. The nobles immediately began to panic and claim that Royd was a liar, and that nothing he said was true. The furious empress summoned magicians to cast a spell of confession on the nobles. The nobles who spoke were punished before the empress began arresting everyone. Royd watched the process with Xavier, convinced that the queen must have forgotten he existed, so he could sneak back into the village. When Sir Kyle appeared behind him, he told him to leave only after attending the banquet. The next day, he also told Royd that the queen said his plan to create a diversion with the academy was excellent, and she respected his desire to live a lazy life. Kyle leaves him a little dumbfounded. Even Xavier couldn't sense his approach considering that Kyle is the best swordsman in the kingdom. Later, Royd talks to Julian about the events and how he guessed what would happen. Julian tells Royd that he doesn't have to force himself to curse him because he trusts his brother and is proud of him. The swarm stepped aside and received a significant increase in RP on his balance sheet. Later, at a royal banquet, the empress asked Royd to come to her, and she mocked her husband a bit with Xavier. So before the empress ordered the swarm to fulfill her order, he reluctantly stepped forward. The queen told him that she would prepare everything for him if he ever changed his mind. She then leaves the swarm to enjoy his newfound financial freedom. The man begins to eat to his heart's content and suddenly realizes that his insurance will lapse in 3 years because of the evil queen. Royd suddenly hears the phrase that the feast will last until the moon sets. As Kyle walks behind him, the young frontman remembers it from the time when the queen was poisoned and lost one of her arms. It was another secret code used by those who planned the assassination, which was not to take place for another 3 years. In the inner chambers, the queen sat down on the sofa and thought that perhaps she had overdone it. She seemed to be overworked, given the floods, the academy with Ashfagan, a hostile state led by Samarkand that was gathering an army in its western lands. She did not yet fully believe that this was a threat, because in that case they would have to cross the wilderness to attack. Alicia suddenly began to have a severe headache. Her condition was deteriorating, and she realized that she had been poisoned. She tried to leave the room when she saw Kyle at the door, thinking he had come to help, but instead he was gone. Suddenly, Royd asked Xavier to come with him, because the man sensed that something was wrong and that Xavier might have to distract the sword master.